I call the Cuyahoga County Council Operations, Intergovernmental Relations, and Public Transportation Committee to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Calling the roll, Ms. Baker.
Here.
Ms. Simon. Ms. Simon is absent at the moment. Mr. Jones.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Mr. Schrein.
Here.
There is a quorum.
Thank you. Is there anyone signed in for public comment?
Yes, Madam Chair, you have two people signed in. The first is Ms. Alana Faith.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Alana Faith, and I'm a Cleveland homeowner, and I rely on RTA paratransit as my primary transportation. I'd like to bring to your attention, I think we have copies for you that will be available, an article by the Cleveland Plain Dealer Editorial Board published on Sunday, January 6th, entitled, "The Greater Cleveland RTA Board Needs New Faces." The editorial notes that long-term board members should be held culpable for serious management failures and lapses in oversight of GCRTA's management. Among those being, RTA remains under dangerous financial stress. RTA requires entirely new management at all levels. The recent resignation letter of board member Nick Nardi points out the extent of poor practices within RTA and the non-collaborative corporate climate. RTA still has not answered to or resolved the issue of a lost $1.1 million used by a departed board member. Joe Calabrese held 4 positions of CEO, general manager, secretary, and treasurer while funding was lost for RTA, service spiraled towards death, and the $1 million went missing. Yet there has been no investigation. There must be a new board that will ensure the CEO, general manager, secretary, and treasurer positions are held by different people. The new board must ensure that there is transparency and better oversight of financial management. The Plain Dealer editorial states that RTA requires a fresh group for its board. The RTA board must include people that use RTA as primary transportation, which is not the case now. Full-time RTA riders are the experts on how Cleveland's public transit system functions. In a 360-day period last year, I rode paratransit and RTA 283 rides. And I am representative of many paratransit people, particularly those who go to dialysis on a regular basis, and also those that rely on paratransit Monday through Friday to commute back and forth to work. I would ask County Council that they must appoint riders to the RTA board, and please set the precedent for other appointing agencies to do so as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
The next speaker is Ms. Liu.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'm here for the new year. I'm here to support our Inspector General's office for whatever they have been doing for us. Yay! Now, it goes to RTA too. I'm sorry. This morning, I attended their board meetings. In the past, I have come in here to tell you that RTA board is a very close-minded board, unlike you guys. Even when we had Q transformation, Metro Health transformation, well, our county jail recently, no matter how many people come up here to talk, you guys listen. Doesn't matter what they say. Sometimes they say positive things, sometimes they say negative stuff. However, today, RTA board did the same thing as before. They actually felt that it's too much negative comments. So I went up there, I told them honestly, I said, you don't have to be a spaghetti Western fans or fans of Clint Eastwood to know everything in this world, we have the good, the bad, and the ugly. And don't forget, the word truth often used with the word ugly as ugly truth. So if the board, you guys don't open up your ears, open up your eyes to see what's happening, then how can the bad and ugly to get corrected, improved into the good, right? So today, another issue really funny here. They had a worry about people will sell their discount bus ticket to second market. These people are in a program in a low-income housing. They buy monthly RTA pass every month as a part of their rent. In that case, they can go to doctor appointments, go to job appointments, and do other things to improve their lives. Isn't that a good idea? But guess what? The board member actually worry about these people. They may sell the bus ticket to other people. I mean, what's the world today? People forgot we should be here to help one another instead of suspect one another and think everybody will do the wrong thing. Come on. We renew the new blood, fresh mind into this board. So they will be function like you guys to improve RTA services. Right now, the worst part of their service from riders' point of view is they have no customer service. The most of the trouble is from their customer service. No matter how you call them, how you write them letters, how you send them emails, they actually refuse to answer you. They put you on hold, they hang up on you. This is a public service funded by taxpayers' money, not a private organization for profit. But look at what they are thinking. While you guys here are keep thinking about doing more things to help people out, for the whole county to progress, and we have the public service acting like that. Please help. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's all. All right, right now let's, would ask for a motion to approve the minutes from the September 18th, 2018 meeting.
So approved. So moved.
Second, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Passes. Okay, Madam Clerk, please read the matters referred to committee.
Ordinance number 2018-0013, amending section 204.01 of the county code to require county agencies to provide a response to recommendations issued as part of an investigation of the Inspector General, and to update the county code in accordance with the adoption of Article 15 of the county charter.
Thank you. I've asked Michael King to come forward and give us a brief overview of the ordinance 2018-0013. It will also include the charter amendments that passed on the ballot. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, and members of the committee. Michael King, council staff. As the chair mentioned, she asked me to provide a quick overview of the legislation before you today. And basically, this does two fundamental things. First, the ordinance requires agencies or departments under investigation by the Inspector General to provide written responses to the IG whenever the IG recommends an agency or department take a particular action. This is very similar to how audits typically work as well. So these aren't audits, but they're investigations, and there have been instances in the past where the IG has made recommendations of corrective action of some nature. So this can take place either prior to the close of an investigation, similar to audits, or after the investigation is complete at the discretion of the Inspector General. And that will really come down to the nature of the investigation and the sensitivity of things in that, unique to that particular situation. If the agency agrees with a particular recommendation, the agency is required to specify what remedial actions will be taken, if any. And if the agency disagrees with a particular recommendation, the response must include a rationale for that disagreement. The IG is also required to include a summary of any recommendations and their corresponding responses in his or her semi-annual report. So the second thing this ordinance does is really routine housekeeping following the adoption of the charter amendment last fall by the county voters. And basically it brings the county code in line with the charter amendment that was approved last fall. quick summary of these include things like the process for approving the Inspector General's budget, the process for the appointment, removal, and term of the Inspector General, the IG's qualifications, a statement of the IG's authority to issue subpoenas to compel the attendance of witnesses and production of records. And then in addition, there's an authorization for the IG to take steps to preserve the anonymity of complainants or sources. And that's basically it for the ordinance. I will just note that we did provide a draft of this legislation to the Inspector General before it was introduced, so he's had an opportunity to review it. He provided, I think, some valuable feedback. So he's here today, so if you have any questions in particular for him, I'm sure he'd be happy to come and answer them. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. And
Good, thank you, Michael, I appreciate that. Yes, as Michael has stated, not only does this include the housekeeping for the charter amendments that were approved that this committee heard, but also it includes some language that I asked both Councilman Miller and our Attorney General and Michael King to be a part of, that really does reinforce the accountability on our part as County Council to see what the results are from the investigations of our departments and agencies. And it's really just as simple as that. When we've heard through our semi-annual reports here in this committee, sometimes we will ask, well, what is the result of the investigation? What have you heard? What are the action steps? Do they agree, not agree? And sometimes we get an answer of, I don't know, it's not really up to me to enforce it. It's up to you to enforce it. And at that point, I thought that this legislation would be a tool for us to be able to have it included as part of our semi-annual report so that we can see without asking those departments clearly written what it is that they plan to do. And it really needs to be clear that we're not asking that they agree, we're just asking them to respond. Or they could say, no, I absolutely don't agree, that's the worst recommendation I've ever heard and this is why. Or yes, we do agree, but maybe not the action steps that were recommended. Or maybe they'll agree completely and let us know what their timeline is and recommendations that they may have along with the Inspector General. So what this is. It's just an accountability piece that allows us to have that extra tool to be able to review what has been reviewed by and investigated by our Inspector General. Is there any questions yes, Councilman Miller.
Just a comment, I would like to commend Councilwoman Baker for bringing this legislation forward. The Inspector General has made it pretty clear that he sees the role of the Inspector General's office to do the investigation, but not to do the enforcement. And that makes a certain sense, but at the same time, we don't want the Inspector General reports to be issued and just collect dust without us knowing what the results or the action taken as a result of those are. And so I think this legislation provides the right balance. It continues the process that the Inspector General's role is to investigate potential problems and provide reports. And the legislation provides a mechanism to ensure that the reports are responded to and that we're able to find out what actions have or have not been taken. So I commend you for this and strongly support the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Any other questions? Yes, Councilman Tron.
What if there's a simultaneous action being taken, like by the state auditor, in this particular case where we had audited some records and the Inspector General is conducting an independent audit, an independent inspection out there? What happens if there's a disagreement between what the Inspector General believes should be the cause an effect and writes up an opinion, and the auditor has a different opinion of that exact same fact circumstance?
That's an interesting question. I think, and I defer to Mark if he had something to share on this, but I would probably say, I mean, when you think about the Office of the Inspector General and the function of an auditor, they're similar in many ways, but they're I think fundamentally looking at two different things. The IG is really looking at conflicts of interest, ethical violations, things of that nature. The auditor is often looking at things around controls and accounting and making sure there's the proper documentation to back up certain activities. Now, obviously, there's going to be some overlap there. If you don't have the proper controls in place, you're going to run into opportunities for ethical violations. So that's certainly a concern. But I do believe our Inspector General, or at least our current Inspector General, has made an effort to at least coordinate with both our internal auditor and state auditor to try and not step on each other's toes. But there's nothing specifically in the legislation that addresses that fact circumstance. So,
Well, and it's not I don't think it's a big stretch, because we just had this situation recently in regards to the Economic Development Department on the loan status, and we know that the Inspector General was looking into that, and we do believe that so was the state auditor.
that's correct. In fact, I think it was the inspector.
One in which it's not a very big stretch to find that you could have had two recommendations.
And I think that circumstance actually was one where the Inspector General went in first and found some issues, and that spurred the state auditor to come in and take a closer look as well. So it was sort of a one and then the other, but there certainly was some overlap, and I believe there was an outside consultant also brought in to take a look at the development loan portfolio. So there's probably some redundancy there, but at the same time, you could argue that they're looking at the same underlying materials from sort of different angles. But
Yeah,
point is well taken.
I realize that there's a possibility of redundancy. I'm concerned about the recommendation piece when they both are in the same exact space. I mean, it's I don't want to go to the newspaper, but let's just talk about the newspaper in regards to, we know that we could have the Inspector General looking at something going on within county operations right now. I believe we could also have the county prosecutor looking at something, and clearly the FBI could all be looking at something. None of those folks would be coordinating. They'll all operate as independent bodies out there.
That's definitely true. I will say our code does require that if the Inspector General does find some type of criminal wrongdoing, that he refer those matters to the appropriate law enforcement entities. So that could be the FBI or the prosecutor, but.
Yeah, my point by raising that example was that you could have all three in the exact same space.
Sure.
And we do know that we had two in the exact same space. The fact that if it was one of those two bodies that was looking at the contracts within economic development, there would not have been any coordination. There would not even been a handoff. They would have gone independently, and both could have made a recommendation in regards to that. And I'm just asking, so an independent body, state auditor, comes in and recommends X, and the IG comes in and recommends Y, and there's no obligation necessarily to follow the IG's recommendation. In that regards, how do we resolve this, or what happens in regards to that?
Well, I'm not entirely. I don't know that we've run into a circumstance where we've had actual recommendations in conflict with one another. I think there may be some reports that have recommended something, and then another, the auditor might recommend A and the IG might recommend B, and really the answer might be to do both. But it's an interesting scenario where, potentially you could have one recommendation that directly conflicts with another. I think if it came down to the state auditor versus the Inspector General, I mean, at least as it relates to, state law, the auditor, that would probably be something we'd want to address. But I'm having trouble coming up with a scenario where you'd actually run into that direct conflict. That's what's the particular fact scenario
on the area of, in regards to the legal contracts that were both being examined for how the Economic Development Department was fundamentally operating within there. Now let's just all you gotta do is move that fact pattern just even a slight bit as to how they operated, if there was something going on, either a miss or a malfeasance going on, we do know that some of those loans sat there for years out there and didn't get handled. And I'm just merely trying to go into what we're going to do when they write a recommendation. Our particular department, let's just say ED, objects or disagrees with what's going on, and our chairman said, "Well, it's nice to know that we agree or disagree when the department comes out with that." But what is it that we intend to actually happen after we write up this review and the department says, "Nah, I'm going to blow it off. I don't not blow it off, but I'm not going to accept that IG."
Yeah, so I mean, I think Mark's mentioned this, and Councilman Miller noted it as well, is that the IG is really there to shine a spotlight on malfeasance, wrongdoing, things like that. He doesn't actually have enforcement powers.
Right.
So with that in mind, I mean, I would say that if a report came out with it where the IG makes a finding or a recommendation of some kind, that it would be incumbent not only on the department but on the county leadership as a whole to take corrective action in whatever form that may be, whether it's the department drawing up new policies, whether there's disciplinary action that needs to be taken against particular individuals, or whether the council needs to pass an ordinance to address an ongoing issue. It would really depend on the circumstances, but your point is well taken in the sense that the IG's report does not have any type of binding impact beyond simply stating what, in his view, either does or does not comply with the county's ethics code.
Yeah, and I guess another one that wouldn't be very, very far stretched is the jail. We got two different reports from two different bodies, and if the IG was in there as a third body and makes a recommendation, could be in disagreement with the marshal's report versus the state report versus something of that nature. So I'm just curious as to what the procedural steps will be to cure that, any disagreements that might exist and recommendations that might come out. And you're putting our folks who are probably trying to do their best job they can, whether it be wherever part of the county government, and just want to make sure we have clarity as far as what they're seeing, because confusion could result, it seems like, potentially, if you've got multiple recommendations coming to a single department from two different or three different bodies out there.
Right, if I may, I think the intent of the bill is to just get an answer back. It doesn't, they could come back with an answer and say, I've got a couple other opinions, so we're investigating which opinion is correct, and we'll come back to you with a plan when we've had enough scope of what it is that we're being asked to do. I think it's more that we're looking for 99% of what the the Inspector General does. We'll have an answer. We'll be able to get our arms around and understand what the action plan is from the department. In those few that might have more than one recommendation from more than one party, then that could be the answer back. We can't give you an answer right now. We need more time to investigate or consider what the other opinions are. And in your next 6 months, when we have another report, we hopefully will have clarity as to what is the best steps for our department to take, and we'll take those steps in the interim. So I don't think we're looking for any hard and fast answers, especially for those that could be more complicated than what the Inspector General may find from a certain department and offer some recommendations. It's more of us being more aware of what it is that's being investigated and have the understanding that if it's the only opinion, that opinion is being answered, that we have some type of action plan, that there is an acknowledgement that yes, we either agree, we disagree, or we have our own ideas as to what it is that we need to do. I don't think that for the exceptions that we shouldn't be better informed for the rule of what it is that the Inspector General does and what he investigates and what he tells us and what should be included in his report.
Yeah, I was just trying to focus on at least a couple of current events that are pretty clear out there, and what the resolution is intended by by this, because you don't want to draft what has elements of being quasi-legal, as far as legal procedures out there, and not have those steps clearly identified. I mean, is there an appellate process that takes place if I disagree? Because this, let's face it, this is going to show up in somebody's career too, ultimately, how you respond. And I would think it's going to show up in their personnel jacket on something of that nature if you get written up. So,
Yeah. Well, we are asking for, if they disagree, we're just asking for a rationale response as to why. You know, I think that it's a simpler ask than what perhaps we're making it out to be. It is just an answer back for the Inspector General's investigation as to what are you going, this has now been brought to your attention, our attention, instead of letting it sit in the book and wonder in the next 6 months, will we go back and say whatever happened to that recommendation that was made in your department, we would have that included as part of the report. And that's the intent of the bill. If it gets more complicated than that, if there's more parties involved, then of course, there's nothing here that says that that the action is non-action. That could be their answer. But at least we get an answer, whereas right now we don't.
okay, well, again, just relating back to the jail, if the IG was in there 8 months ago,
Yeah.
ahead of the other reports, there might be a reluctance if misfeasance or malfeasance has taken place to even make any answer, because you don't want to go on the record in regards to that. So I just trying to probe on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank you for letting me come in after the meeting started.
Of course.
I have to say that right now we are getting answers to recommendations when we have committee meetings. I mean, it happens all the time that we get the reports, we bring people in, I'll cite the loan, I'll cite the jail, I'll cite every other situation that comes up, that we actually do have a forum for a response to be given to the council. So I don't understand why we want to micromanage this and have something in writing. I might have missed the beginning of this, but there's always a place and we always hear them. So it's happening at least in our open meetings.
I think there are times, the larger issues like the jail and even the ED, things that make the paper and front page, that certainly is something. But there are many things that the Inspector General does and investigates that aren't front page, that are sometimes things that we don't get another follow-up on, that don't make the level of high news that we might have a committee about. But there are many things that he does, many things. If you go through the semi-annual report, you would see many different occasions where things are asked and we never really know whether or not they have been resolved. Sure, the high level, and I think as Councilman Tron has indicated, that sometimes is more than what we would get in an Inspector General's report. It's bigger than that, and other people chime in. But for the day in, day out type of investigations that go on, we never really know during the semi-annual reports what the results of that was. And that really is the premise of this, is to get those answers back so that we're always aware of not only what is being investigated, but what the answers are back. And like I said, doesn't have to agree, you can disagree. But at least we know that it was looked at and acknowledged and answered. And that's really what this is all about.
So, Madam Chair, did the Inspector General testify that he is not getting responses from the department?
Yeah, if I can ask the inspector to come up.
Thank you, Chairwoman Baker.
You're welcome, thank you.
Council members. I'd like to first of all say thank you. Thank you for the hard work putting into this. And I think sort of the issues have been summarized before I've had a chance to stand up and speak here today. But I do think that this is an important step forward in terms of transparency and responsiveness and accountability. And I'm not sure which question or issue I should address first, but let me talk first of all about responsive and responsiveness. The majority of departments are responsive, but it's where there's a problem or where there's an issue that they're not responsive. And so I'm going to talk about a couple different issues. First of all, I want to say that in the last 18 months, the Department of Development has really been very good. The staff there for the last 18 months, and I want to really highlight Greg Huth and Brian Edwards and Asona as well, as really being excellent. But before they got there, I spent 2 years submitting reports and pointing out problems in the loan portfolio for which there was no answer of any kind. And it wasn't until the county executive and this council got involved that then there was motion as well. So I get responses for the vast majority of issues, except sometimes where there's a problem. And I think there are a couple of values to having mandatory responses. And again, these are neither agree or disagree. They can say that I'm completely wrong, or they can say yes, or they can say something in between. I'd also note that a mandatory response is common among other inspectors general around the country. I'm a board member of the National Association of Inspectors General, and I would say there's a substantial minority, probably a third to 40% of IGs that have this sort of requirement. I wouldn't say that it's a majority, but it's not unusual at all. And what it creates is a management tool. So we then have kind of a checklist of recommendations, and then you can match them against what the responses are, or if there's a failure to respond. It also provides me with a little extra support, and you as well, on those instances where I needed a response. It shouldn't require the county executive to intervene personally. It shouldn't necessarily require you to intervene either, but it should be understood just to be as a regular part of good government to respond. Let me talk a little bit about inconsistent possibilities. So we actually opened up the Department of Development investigation, and I think we've been completely consistent with the auditors and I kind of work hand in glove in that, and we find ourselves to be in agreement. But the other piece to where I think the conflict is mitigated is because I don't have enforcement powers. So I can't order someone to do something. So I think, as Chairwoman Baker mentioned, a response could simply be, well, the state auditor says it's different. The other piece that I would say is that my jurisdiction is limited. I don't opine on the Ohio Revised Code. My authority is limited to the County Ethics Code, and then I have debarment powers as well. But there may be a difference of view, but that can be resolved by the department saying, well, we disagree, or we have a contrary view by this other entity. And I always have to give way to the state powers. The state auditor has supremacy over anything that I say, with the possible exception of the County Ethics Code. Let me also talk about kind of simultaneous state investigations, and I'm supposed to keep confidential all my investigations, but once you start asking questions and doing walkthroughs of the jail, people understand that you're looking at it. And so specifically to a current situation, we opened up an investigation regarding jail issues that we have seen. And we were, I'd say, probably about a month ahead of the Federal Bureau. But once the U.S. Marshals came in, we were required to step back. And actually, they were tremendously welcoming, and we worked with them while they were here. But during that period of time, our ordinance requires us not to interfere with any other investigation. So we take that very seriously to avoid conflict with either federal authorities, other state authorities, our internal auditor. And then that, in turn, delays our review, but that's okay because we've learned a lot from them as well. So in terms of possible conflict, what I would say is that can simply be reviewed as part of their responses. And in terms of are we really having problems with the lack of responses, I think on important issues, it doesn't happen very often, but it does, and I think it provides a management tool for us. So I am fully supportive of this legislation. I think it's a step forward for transparency and accountability, and I think it'll be helpful.
Thank you. Any questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Did you want to
If
follow
I
up?
have a couple questions.
Sure.
So what happens if they do not respond?
Then I think I would probably need to come back to you or to the executive. Actually, the way these things usually work is I send a letter saying, it's a violation of the ordinance to interfere with an IG investigation. In the new situation, it would be, it's a violation of the ordinance to fail to respond. You need to respond, or else I will elevate it to council or to the executive.
So there's no penalty or anything, it's more just giving more teeth to the demand?
Yes, other than the penalty that this body or the executive chooses to enforce. And let me also say this, which is inspectors general don't have enforcement powers. And I think that's the way to balance the powers given to my office to investigate and report without letting us be the judge, jury, and executioner. So although I am frustrated sometimes that I don't have remedial powers, I think it's an appropriate balance for this office.
So the other question I have, Madam Chair, if I can, is in Section E that we're considering today, this indicates that prior to completing investigation, the IG may provide an opportunity for the agency to department to submit a response. Did you talk about this being a may instead of a shall? Why, this provision states, Mike King wants to come up. So prior to giving a recommendation, the IG may or may not ask for a response from the department that's being investigated. Shouldn't this, why isn't that a shall?
So that actually was a shall in an early draft of the legislation. The reason in discussion it was changed was because of the fact that, unlike an audit, sometimes investigations by the Inspector General are sensitive in nature to the point where he may not want to provide the contents of a report or a recommendation prior to the close of that investigation. So it's a discretionary thing. So the IG, if it's appropriate, can ask that those written responses be provided prior to the release of the report. But in the case that that doesn't happen, then they're required to provide it within 30 days, I believe, after the report's been issued.
And let me also speak to the different types of activities that we do. So for something like a review where we're looking for operations or we're looking at an entire department, I want to have comments on a draft. And so I circulate a draft because I want my final report to be correct. I want to hear if there are any mistakes that department can indicate it, because these are kind of policy and operations pieces. But sometimes I'm asked to have, we also use the term investigation, but it's really a different thing. It's not a review, it's an investigation of a violation of an ethical code, perhaps discriminatory conduct, where just like an attorney would do it, you would have your report, but you wouldn't necessarily then let someone else amend or edit or review your report before you issued it. So I think that has something to do with the different types of investigations are really different than the reviews, but sometimes we use the term as the same.
So, as part of your investigations, do you, as a matter of course, give the department or individuals in that department a chance to respond as you're conducting the investigation, or are there times when that's not always the case?
Well, we interview them and we give them the opportunity. There are times when people refuse to speak with us. So we have something going on right now where we've asked the individual who is the subject of that to respond. And it's been 8 weeks now, and neither he nor his attorney have gotten back to us. And so, we've moved forward from that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's only fair that happens if you're going to issue a report, that you give those being considered in violation to have a chance to respond. And I don't know if we need to say that, that as part of your investigation, that you're giving people a chance to discuss what you're investigating, or maybe that's not always the case.
I don't think it's always the case. I mean, there's always an opportunity to respond later. The question is whether the response is mandatory or part of an investigation rather than a review.
Okay. Okay. My questions are answers for now. Thanks.
Thank you. And I really am comfortable with the may, from shall to may, because I do want it to be at the discretion of the Inspector General, and he's the one in the position of asking and reviewing and investigating. Our point in this legislation is just to get an answer back, if in fact an answer is what it is that we can get back. We just don't want the silence. That's really the piece that I want to make sure that when we go through this committee and we're getting a semi-annual report, that there isn't silence to some of the questions that we may ask that we haven't heard yet back from that department. But certainly from the shall to may, I'm comfortable with, because I think that the Inspector General should have the discretion of knowing just how hard he can ask, given the circumstances that he's in. Councilman
Thank you.
Jones, go right ahead.
The response from those that you're requesting, is the response in a sense requiring them to acknowledge any guilt or anything? Is
No,
this
they
the type
can-
of question that's being asked?
So I believe this is fundamentally for reviews where I'm suggesting, trying to think about a specific example, but we'll go back to the loans just because that's been somewhat voluminous, where we say there should be a hard close on your accounts. And the Department of Development has pushed back on that, saying, well, we disagree with that because we believe we'll lose some data on that. So they don't have to admit guilt or innocence, but because it's not really a guilt or innocence issue so much as it is, tell me if you agree. If you disagree, tell me why. And if you disagree but think there's a different solution, tell me what that solution is.
Right.
Okay.
That is,
Madam Chair, if I might, I'd like to also make one other point, which is my experience over the 4 years that I've had this job is that sometimes people don't answer your questions. And although many times you do get answers from department heads, there have been, on too many occasions, situations where sometimes it's been like pulling teeth. Yeah. And so if this assists in that process, I think it's also a step forward. The last piece I would say is this is also accountability for my office, because it then lets you review my office in terms of what are the recommendations you've made and are you being effective in what you're doing. And so, I think I think everyone needs to be accountable, my office as well as those who I review.
good. Did you have something else?
Can you speculate on why agencies don't respond? What are their rationale? It's just speculating why they don't respond.
Well, sometimes because they don't have to, sometimes because they disagree. I think that for some of the reports, if they weren't required to respond, then there wasn't a lot more publicity or attention paid to it. And so sometimes it's better not to repeat the story or respond to it and keep that story going. So I think that's part of it. And listen, some of them, sometimes they disagree and they just say, no, you're wrong, but we're not going to tell you why.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead, Councilman Schron.
Yeah, based on that response, if I am concerned about perhaps my activity or my action, I'm not going to tell you why. Well, I'm sticking my neck out at that point in time. I've written something in writing in a public and a document that could come back to haunt me if there's any element whatsoever of criminality. I'm not going to tell you why. I'm just going to say I choose not to respond. And what do we get any better than what you currently have? I guess we have abstinence, which doesn't tell you anything, but at least if they tell you, no, I'm not going to respond, that told you something, but not a whole lot. I could see in the particular example you just raised that if this individual is with counsel, I can't believe any counsel is going to tell them to respond to anything out there. So I'm not sure how we've changed the situation in that case.
Well, as I understand it, that they need to respond whether they agree or disagree. So it's not, the response can't be, I'm not responding.
Right.
But I'm still an attorney. As an attorney, I'm putting that hat on. And you said something to the effect of, is it correct that you improperly handled the way these loans were done based on X, Y, or Z? And if I say I disagree, then I've stuck my neck on one direction. If I say I agree, I've stuck my neck the other direction. So as counsel, I'm going to say don't respond at all, period.
Could be. I do think that I think most people have dealt with us in good faith. But I see your point.
Yeah, I'm just trying to prepare us for the person who screwed up, and you say, hey, let's fix this. They're the willing party. They're gonna they're going to thank you for pointing out the errors of operation. The person who screwed up and did it with known criminality or suspected criminality in their own mind, they're not going to respond, I wouldn't think, are going to help us out at all. But that's just my belief as far as what you'd see once they get lawyered up.
Well, let me, and I hate to keep going back to Department of Development, but what we saw there was for 2 years, we didn't get any answers at all. Once a new set of responsive leaders came into that department, they then did respond, and they didn't agree with everything, as I've mentioned, but at least we got a response there. And so, I think that this legislation will move us from the no response at all to at least getting something from them.
Okay, well, I guess I don't want to create a solution that doesn't fix the problem, because I can only imagine that when you came to my committee, we got action, and this, by the same token, whether or not they respond or didn't respond, the problem was what you were pointing out, and we agreed that the problem needed to be fixed. And so when you go back and put pressure on that department, they responded once the sunlight came on the problem.
I would say, and I hate to throw our internal auditor under the bus or raise his name in vain, but my sense is that when the internal auditor submits his recommendations, he has been getting responses. And so to the extent that my office can be brought into a consistent level with the internal auditor, I would think that would be a step forward as well.
Right, that is true. This would be consistent with what we do with the auditor.
Madam Chair, I have a question about the auditor. Is that mandated that they have to provide a written response? I'm sorry, Madam Chair, but it's
Go right ahead.
right on point.
Hi, council members. Corey Swayze, good director of internal audit. Yes, it actually is mandated by our internal audit charter that we have through the audit committee. So the audit committee back in 2013, I believe, they approved an internal charter for us to follow, and part of that process is to require responses from all of our auditees.
Madam Chair, to our internal auditor, what happens if they don't respond?
If they do not respond, then we require their attendance at the next audit committee meeting.
How do you require that?
I asked them to attend the next meeting, and with the executive and council president on the committee, they make it required that they be there for the next meeting.
Okay. So, Madam Chair, it appears to me that this provision, that we're considering would just provide additional teeth to kind of as a threat. If you don't do this, you're violating the ordinance, versus the ability right now to come to council committees like has been happening in the past to find redress for lack of response. I think most of this happens, they just do it, they comply, but there's a small number that may not. And I think we're already rectifying that by the ability to come to a committee chair and say, let's bring in the department to testify about why they're not responding. My concern is with Jack Schron, my colleague, about on any kind of incrimination to force them to give a rationale. It's not simply, I don't have to respond or I don't want to respond. It's forcing them to actually commit to a rationale. And that's different from the internal auditor, I think. This is a quasi-criminal procedure. And I'm uncomfortable with forcing them to give a rationale why they might have screwed up that might come back criminally to haunt them in writing and force them to do this. Plus, it's not even enforceable. I mean, to begin with, this ordinance is not enforceable in any way, except to come before us and say you violated this. There's nothing penalizing them. So it's not enforceable. It subjects them to giving a rationale, which I'm going to object to if I'm even going to support this, because it may put somebody in jeopardy. Are they supposed to take the fifth? I mean, what are they supposed to do? And that looks bad in public if they're really not criminally liable. So I'm not comfortable with giving a rationale, and I think this is a little bit too much if you've got somebody who has some criminal or problems with the law.
Yeah, I think that the Inspector General has given a pretty good explanation of pretty much every circumstance that has been asked of him. I don't see where better transparency and accountability for us when we're reviewing the semi-annual report to make sure that what the inspector has reviewed and investigated, we have a good understanding of what is happening because of that. I think that the exceptions are there. I think the inspector has explained himself as good as he possibly can as to why this legislation is important. It's just whether or not we want to know, whether or not we, want to get the type of direction that would come that perhaps would not make it scale to a level where it's out of control. And if we would have only asked sooner or understood it sooner. Councilman Miller, did you have a question?
I have a comment that in the response that's requested, I don't think we're asking the respondent to justify or defend their behavior. I think what we're asking them to do is to explain whether they agree or disagree with the Inspector General's analysis and recommendation. And I think those are two different things. I don't think that the requirement is for the respondent to defend their behavior. The respondent, what the request is whether you agree with the IG's suggestion and if not, why you think the Inspector General's analysis is not a correct interpretation of the situation at hand.
Right,
Madam Chair, if I may.
yes.
I do think that one of the difficulties is the language conflates these two different concepts of investigation, and maybe there's a way that we can tweak or clarify the language to make it clear that a review of a department's operations it would be different or would apply to recommendations regarding the efficient operations of a department, but not necessarily an investigation where a person is asked to admit to certain facts or that sort of thing. In my office, by the way, once there is a reasonable belief of any criminal activity, we're required to refer it out. So we have to stop anytime we believe that there's really even any reasonable suspicion. And maybe we're struggling with the language to clarify that this is essentially an efficiency review of how to improve county operations. And that would just be my observation of how to resolve some of these very valid issues because our English language, or perhaps it's my terminology, hasn't clarified things as well.
Okay, any other comments? Yes.
Michael Clay's concept.
And then Councilman
Madam Chair.
Jones had a question after you
Just
finished.
very quickly, another point of clarification, I think, that sort of relates to what Mark was just talking about, is that this doesn't necessarily necessitate a response for every investigation. It talks about recommendations to agencies and departments. So if the Inspector General makes some finding, I mean, I think in the development review investigation, whatever we want to call it, I think a good example might be the policies and procedures for writing off loans. I think the concept of you could make an ethical violation, a finding of an ethical violation for a certain loan write-off, right? Maybe there's some violation that took place there, but at the end of that investigation, there might be a recommendation that, hey, we should have a policy for how we write off loans to avoid the opportunity for this ethical violation to happen in the future. And so it's those types of recommendations that necessitate a response. It's not necessarily it doesn't mandate a written response to a particular finding that's made by the IG. So just one point of
Thank you for that clarification.
Well,
Even with that, I still think, I can't help but think about, someone's guilt. Most of the times people respond. It's routine, matter of fact, and you reach out and they respond. It's that minority that don't respond. But again, I keep thinking, what's their rationale? What's their reason for not responding? and no one wants to incriminate themselves. Can't say what percentage that is, but I would think their failure to respond has to do with somewhere in, whether it's criminal or just mismanagement or some small, whatever the issue might be, a sense of not wanting to incriminate themselves. And sometimes it's important just to know that, see who responds and who doesn't. And right now, we still have in place a mechanism. When you have that section or segment of the population who does not respond when they should, okay, then the next step is to bring it back to this council, just like the audit committee. If you've been called into the room with the county executive and the council president, and you didn't respond, you know I better show up to that meeting. So it's the same. They come here, the Department of Development. We know the challenges that were there, but how did they address it? Not just a letter in response to the IG, but they came back to council and it was fully vetted in the committee, and they are doing better. They are moving in the right direction, but they had to come before us. I do struggle with that balance between someone having to necessarily incriminate themselves potentially in a letter, and well, I'll leave it at that.
I think as Councilman Miller, though, explained, it's not an accusation against someone personally. It's a response to the review of what it is that could be improved, and we're asking for a response. Did you understand the improvement? Can you let us know whether you agree with whether those steps should be improved? And if not, why not? If so, what is your action plan? I don't think that there's any personal accusation of wrongdoing. It is more of a response that we have our Inspector General out there working, trying to let us know what's going on in these departments, and getting a response back. It's just it's coming full circle. That's all this legislation is trying to do. As Councilwoman Simon said, it just gives that added teeth to getting the responses back, so that it's not just silence when a question is being asked or when a review is being looked at. It's just that added, we don't want the silence. We want to know, do you agree, disagree? And if you don't agree, why? If it raises to the level of a criminal act, first of all, I guess we would like to know who are silent, and maybe that does trigger something else. But I think that it's just an accountability piece for us to know what the responses are when these type of things are raised by our Inspector General. That's why he's out there. That's what his job is. And our job is to follow up to see whether or not those questions have been answered. And that's as simple, we try to create this as simple as possible to let all of those what ifs not be part of this so that it complicates it. It is, I think, very simply written, and if it does reach the level of prosecution or there's any wrongdoing, the Inspector General steps aside and the prosecutor's office takes over. We are not involved in that at all. Yes.
Madam Chair, and I applaud our current Inspector General, quality guy, doing good things. But when you write legislation like this is not for our current one. This is for on infinitum. And my concern is down the road. Mr. King said, well, if they write up and say, we're talking about how we write off a loan and what the procedures are. I'm concerned, and so that's a procedural aspect. We say, okay, let's discuss the procedural aspect. I'm sure the people down at the jail will argue that it was a procedure whereby they withheld food. It was a procedure that somebody in their mindset, whether it was a written procedure or an actionable procedure by activity, that you'll sleep on the floor. It was a procedure that somebody wrote down that you're going to be withheld, we're going to withhold bathroom privileges. Those were procedures. They were not necessarily written ones, but they were at least administered, and I can see our good quality Inspector General would have said, these are incorrect procedures, fix them. Now, you're the administrator in charge of that department. Any response on that question would be putting yourself in jeopardy, I believe. putting that hat on. I'll ask, I mean, we have two attorneys up here in front of us, as a matter of fact, that are,
I think neither of us are criminal attorneys.
well, I was, and so I would not advise the client to get involved with responding to, if you were to present me with those questions on not the fact pattern of the loans, because, yeah, I agree 100%. We want to improve procedures and process and how we do county government, and I don't think anybody will be against that. And if you say, hey, you should do step 1, 2, and 3 of how you write the loans off, please tell me what we're doing to improve that. I think we all cheer that on, but it's the what ifs, and we're not talking about a what if that's not possible. We're talking about a what if that's currently in play, and those were all procedures. So.
And I think, neither of us are criminal attorneys, so we'll leave the application of the law to the facts in that regard to the criminal attorneys. But I think it's safe to say that nothing in this ordinance or the charter would override the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
No,
So-
I agree.
Right, so.
Madam Chair?
I think, yes.
Madam Chair, and that's the point. So if we're going to force somebody to assert the Fifth Amendment as part of this, which would, totally taint them, if the recommendation is not founded, then they have to assert the Fifth, and I don't think it's fair. And I practice criminal law, and I'm uncomfortable with this, especially with the language about rationale, giving an explanation. But I want to raise the issue that when we actually created this ordinance early on in the new government, I'm not sure that the Inspector General's job was to go into departments to oversee their efficiencies. I thought we have a Department of Innovation now that's supposed to be doing this. And I don't understand, even as I look at this, why the Inspector General is the person who's going in and overseeing operations of the department. This was a very narrowly conceived department that would be there to look for corruption or those type of ethical violations. What I'm hearing with the Department of Development and Loans, that's not really our vision at the beginning of this, of what the Inspector General should be doing. And I want to say we have a department for that. And what is that department doing, and why isn't it doing it? And why are you doing it? I'm not even going to support this, even on those grounds alone. I think we're getting far afield of what this Inspector General's job is. And I'm glad you're doing it, but I'm not sure this is what you're, from our conception of the ordinance. And I was sat here for months creating this. So I'm not sure why we're going to this far afield.
What do you have to say to that? I mean, that's kind of kind of different than
if I
what
may.
I thought I would hear.
Sure. So part of the charge is also to look for waste, fraud, and abuse and violations of county policy. And sometimes, unfortunately, those then lead to recommendations about changing policy. I have actually tried to stay out of lots of management issues, and because I believe that you could turn anything into an ethics violation, you can turn anything into a policy violation, and so. And I think that in our meetings, over the last few years, I've said, I want to get out of the Department of Development. I don't want to come back and give you another 6-month status report. But I'm also asked to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. And so there's an overlap there. And what I can tell you is I work very hard to stay out of the managerial aspects of it. And I can make recommendations, and they can say, no, I do not and should not have remedial powers, which means that I don't get to hire or fire or make any decisions about employment, criminal charges, policies, approve any contracts. But what I do serve as is a set of independent eyes. And I think just kind of tying things back to the proposed ordinance that's before us, it's to make findings and ask questions. And if departments feel that those questions are inaccurate or inappropriate, then they can respond and say, no, I don't think so. But my job is to provide advice, to provide findings, and then leave it up to others to decide on the management. I don't manage other departments. I don't want to manage other departments. That's not my function.
Right, and I, for one, don't want to see the Inspector General change in what it is that he has been doing. I think that it has brought quite a bit to our attention, and when we have these semi-annual reports, certainly are interested, and we certainly ask questions at that time about what his investigations are and The only piece that always seems to be missing is when that department or agency doesn't respond. That's the piece that we find there's a hole. And that is what this legislation is about. And I certainly don't want to see the Inspector General change anything of what he's doing when it comes to looking into many of our agencies and departments and making sure that there isn't any fraud or abuse, and perhaps efficiencies that, when it's inefficient, that means we lose money. We lose money, that means it's taxpayer dollars that aren't being spent correctly, and that's our job to make sure that they are. So I don't want to see this role change, and this legislation just reinforces what it is that he does and gives us answers so that we can be intelligent about what it is that's going on when he reports to us. And that's a simple, like this, it couldn't be written any simpler than that. If there's any language in here that perhaps, like the word rationale, if you don't want a response back as to why it is that they don't agree, we can take a look at that. If that, makes it a softer bill, but it does drive accountability, and that's what this really is written for. Did you have something?
I do have concerns. I've expressed them, but we've used two examples so far: Department of Development, and made mention of the county jail. So that's obviously a very delicate issue right now. The county, very sensitive and a serious matter. Although that was used in an example, are you here saying today that you have not gotten a response from anyone in the county jail?
We have not issued a report.
No, so that is not,
we have-
although
we
that
have-
has been brought up in this.
Yeah, we have not circulated a draft. Our plan is that when things come together, we'll issue a draft and seek the comment and response of all the interested parties, the jail and others.
So we are not here as a result of a failure of response in regards to the county jail.
Correct, because
Okay,
we
I
haven't
just-
asked them any
You
questions.
just wanted to be clear on that. Okay. All right, thank you.
Madam Chair, can I ask a follow-up to Councilman Jones' question then? What departments, we keep focusing on this Department of Development, what I'm not even sure should be under the, auspice of the IG, that's more, an operation. Why don't you have enough staff to collect loans or, outsource or not? That, I don't think that's an IG job, but beside that, what other departments have you not received responses to that are concerning?
That's the primary one that I can think of offhand. We did a positive report about the Department of Public Works bringing contracts in under budget, so that was obviously not something where we had conflict. That's the one that sticks out as I sit here. I'm sure I can find more, but that's the main one.
One question on that. One question to that. You mentioned the previous directors were less responsive, and now the new ones are responsive. Did you bring? And I can't remember back, so you will be refreshing my memory. But did you bring those previous directors, to this body as a result of them not responding?
We brought the reports, but I don't think that we asked you to intervene at that time.
In the same way that you asked the new directors.
Correct. Correct.
Ask this body to intervene with
Yes.
the new directors.
The thought was, frankly, the belief was that they were going to respond. And I think we wrote four reports over 2 years with no responses whatsoever. But the belief that they were going to, and it never happened. And then finally, I did come to this body, and I went to the county executive, and that then generated some movement, and for which I thank you. And then that also, I think, generated some interest from the state auditor, and they've been very helpful also.
So I still think there's a mechanism. The mechanism is in place. So and again, it is just bringing teeth, as you said, but I'm trying to balance the teeth with the potential of someone incriminating themselves just in the letter. They could be brought back to this body or to their executive, and, as you've done with the Department of Development.
Yeah,
weighing that.
I guess that would be, it seems to be a question that has been asked. Do you think that there is a possibility that when a recommendation is given because there is discovered inefficiencies and someone responds back, do you think can that be incriminating in your opinion?
It potentially could be, but I think let me just say this, which is, I guess I would like to take a look at the experience of the other IGs that have a similar requirement or statute and see if they have run into some of the issues and concerns that you've raised, and provide more information regarding that. The other thing that does happen is that we refer cases to different departments. And so in responding to Councilwoman Simon's question, as opposed to a recommendation, oftentimes we'll refer a matter out for, we think it's very important that we're not the HR department. And so issues come to us that may involve a particular individual, but one of the things that's important is that we support the line supervisors in the different departments and not become the super HR department. So we will have complaints about a particular employee violating an HR policy, and we'll refer that case out. And frequently, we don't get responses about whatever happened to that case. So that's something that we would like to track better as well. And that's very common from HHS to HR to others. And I don't know that there's necessarily anything nefarious with that other than they're not required to respond and they're busy. And so we frequently don't get responses.
Right,
It's busy.
right. Yes, Councilman Schron.
Yeah, just falling back on my recollection as far as IG and in the military, that they would dig into waste, fraud, and abuse. And I would agree that those are areas that perhaps they're well within the scope and they're an area that you dig into. But once you've identified the waste, fraud, or abuse, at least my understanding is it then goes to that convening authority, the person above that position, and say, okay, this is what I found. It's your job as the person to who bears this responsibility ultimately for this department, this person, this whatever it happens to be, to take action based on what we have found. The response then needs to go back to that from the boss, whoever that happens to be, based on this report. Here's what my IG has said, and your obligation is back to me, your superior, to respond. And now the whole HR issue gets in there, and all those things become the enforcement tool to make sure that that response is being done. And again, falling back on my HR, once it hits HR and the corrective action has been taken place, I don't want that. I wouldn't want that being shared with anybody. That's between the supervisor, HR, and the individual, and that's the end of that conversation. It doesn't roll over to any other department. The response would be back from HR's. It's been addressed. Whether you like how it's been addressed or don't, but it's been addressed in some form. At least is my belief as to what happens, because ultimately it's how the department's being run, and that belongs to the supervisor above that stream to hold that department accountable. And if you've given a report to that person, darn straight, I would expect that they're going to respond to their boss. At least that's my belief as procedural steps.
Well, I guess the way I would hope that you would see it is that we are the body that oversees whether or not those things happen. Absolutely, it goes to the director and the boss of that director and the executive and all those things that are in place. But we are here as a county council to oversee that those things do in fact happen. And when we have an inspector general, which we do, and he has a role and he has a place to investigate and brings us on a semi-annual report what it is that he has found, that is a time when it is on our plate. And I don't think it is an outrageous suggestion to say that we need to know what the results were from what it is that he has investigated. And as I said, they don't have to agree or disagree. They just have to answer and acknowledge, so there isn't silence for 2 years wondering whether or not what he has investigated and invested his time in just goes to the wayside. Why did it take 2 years to get an answer out of a department?
But silence is the answer. And if I give silence for 2 years, I'm going to hold that person accountable if I believe that there was legitimacy to the report. That's the answer that.
Madam Chair, I
Years
agree.
has passed.
So if I may, Madam Chair, I totally agree with Councilman Tron. This is what I'm not getting here. It's not up to the Inspector General to demand an answer or to have accountability on a falling away or inefficiency of a department. That's the department head's job. And once the finding is brought forward in a recommendation, it should go, and I think it did, go to the director, Ted Carter, whoever was in charge. And then it's up to us then and the executive to hold that department accountable. And we did. Councilman Tron brought in Ted Carter and his team into committee, and we, for several sessions, grilled them over being accountable for the finding of the IG. But it's not the job of the IG. It's council's job, I absolutely agree, to then follow up. But it shouldn't be coming through the IG. It should be coming through then that department. That's, I think, what needs to happen here. And so we would call in Ted Carter. I don't want to keep picking on him. Sorry, Ted, if you're listening. But that's how council oversees. It's not through the IG. The IG finds, the IG recommends, and then it should go to the whether it's department head and up through the executive. That's where accountability happens, not through the IG.
The point, though, that the IG has made is that he had 2 years of silence, 2 years that we could have been perhaps more proactive if we had known through the Inspector General's report that he has heard nothing. And so 2 years, I'm not sure what the catalyst was in the third year for us to finally realize that there was a problem in that department that needed to be addressed. But this legislation hopefully would have put more teeth into an answer that would have gotten back to us during that report to say, we needed 2 years prior to that to be more proactive in understanding what the problems were in that department and why there isn't a response. That's all this does, is just give us the added teeth to ask and get a response back earlier perhaps than what we would have when it escalates to a point where it is out of control. And that is really all this is doing. It's just, as I said before, it's just an accountability, transparency piece that allows us perhaps earlier than what we may have because it hits the newspapers or the newspapers gets women. We read it and then we react. And this would perhaps give us 2 years prior to knowing that this is being reviewed and investigated, and we really should take seriously what the Inspector General has brought to us, and that director should also. And the 2 years of silence is what this legislation perhaps could prevent. And
Madam
that's
Chair,
all that
if I may, and then I want to yield to Councilman Jones, who wants to speak, but since I brought this up, I want to respond. It was the committee then that dropped the ball by not asking the question of Inspector General when he comes in to report, to say, hey, what's the response? That's up to us to ask that question. For 2 years, yes, there might have been silence, but I don't think you were chair of this committee, and it's up to the committee chair, and I'm sure that the next time we have a report, you're going to ask, and every one of us, what's the response? And then we're going to be on target. But that's where the ball dropped, this is the place to do it. And if the questions aren't asked of the IG, then there's going to be no action. But now we're going to ask these questions, and I believe that's the place to do it. And then we're going to bring in the department head that oversees that particular agency or department. So that's just, I'll be quiet for now, but the ball drops here. And what prompted a change was the IG apparently went to council and went to the executive.
Yeah, the only thing I can say to that is that this is one example, and there could be other examples, but there's so much that perhaps is being looked at or reviewed or investigated that this would just be an added tool for us not to have to remember to ask or go through everything systematically and hear, no, I haven't heard, no, I haven't heard. They've given some responses, but I'm not quite, it gives us something that is more accountable in an answer without us having to continually try to ask. It's just a place where an investigated, answered, response. And that is, that's all this does. It's just an added tool for us to be able to read and understand without having to constantly be probing and asking and remembering with all the things that we have, especially now going on in this county. It just allows us an extra tool, an easier tool to be able to review at the time that this report is given to us. That's all this legislation does. I've heard all the argument. I really don't see where this is anything more than just a place for us to be able to understand what's going on in response to the IG's review. Maybe there's language in here that can be tweaked. We could be probing harder at the Inspector General's report, all of those things. All the result of this legislation would only allow us to be able to do that maybe more efficiently because we're reading more about what it is the response was in that department. I don't know how much clearer, to make it. Go ahead, Rep. Councilman.
As I'm listening to everything, some policies become ordinances, some internal policies, and I totally agree with you. In 2 years, 2 years is too long to wait. But an internal policy that the Inspector General could have used in that time was, I don't have to wait 2 years. I can wait 30 days, or you haven't responded in whatever time you feel is justifiable, and then bring them before this body. So again, to Councilman Simon's point, that in a sense we dropped the ball in that sense. You certainly can bring your questions and concerns to us, that this body knows what needs to be asked, at least from your perspective, obviously what needs to be asked. And 2 years, there should not be a 2-year wait. And again, mechanisms are in place. Policies could be adopted, but then policies do become ordinances. And to that, I'm kind of thinking about it. But my first thought is that it might be that while I think about it, maybe we table it for one committee. Give us a little time to think about it, then come back next committee and make a decision.
Yeah, I think that's probably a wise thing to do. I do think that, the additional transparency and accountability is important. If there's certain language that we need to eliminate or add, certainly I'm open to that. But I don't see where more information and more accountability as to what has been done in the investigations or reviews is a bad thing for us on county council to be able to read and understand. I don't see where there is such a fallout that for us to know what's going on in response to what's been reviewed is not part of what it is that we do here. But I do accept that suggestion.
Madam
Yes.
Chairman? Yes, just to make sure we get the record real clear on this, there was not a 2-year delay in us pursuing this. I sat down with the county inspector general. We worked through this. We actually kept pressure on this department. We didn't get, in that 2 years, we didn't get a successful result. Don't confuse an unsuccessful result with the fact that we kept pressure on that. We didn't, it was, and I know the county inspector general kept pressure on, I know we kept pressure on. We just didn't get to the resolution that we thought was the appropriate business resolution during that 2-year period of time. I believe, without throwing anybody under the bus, that if your boss is hearing for 2 years that you're not getting successful results, that belongs at that level. It doesn't, you were clearly, the IG was clearly making that position well known. This committee, or not this committee, but the committee that was in charge of economic development was clearly making it known. It was in the newspapers, it was everywhere. We didn't get, unfortunately, a satisfactory result for that 2 years. I don't know what any response would have been. It had to get a response at year 2, year 1.5, unless they actually chose to move, or the boss above that department said, we're now going to hold you accountable. It wasn't until the temperature started to rise up from the media, from the committee, from the IG, I truly believe that it was just not perceived as being an important issue. And then it got to the point where the heat got up very, very warm on that issue.
Madam Chair.
At least that's my belief, what happened.
Yes, Councilman Miller.
Madam Chair, I think we have a proposed ordinance that's important but not urgent, and it would be the natural thing to take a couple of meetings and work on getting the language just right, you know. So I support that, and I think we can get there, and I support taking another meeting. Thank you.
Good, and I would ask my fellow colleagues to please respond to Michael King and myself if there's language in this that we could correct before we meet again, that would make it more palatable. From my recollections of those 2 years, I think it was pretty quiet in those 2 years. I don't think that we were involved in the Economic Development Committee working on it during those 2 years of silence. It was raised to a point where I think it was actually leaked to the paper. And we got wind of it, and then we went back and realized that the Inspector General was working on this for a while. I don't see where having the accountability piece of understanding why it is he's not hearing any results from his investigation. It's important enough for him to investigate. It's important enough for him to put in writing, and it's important enough to him to include in his report to us every 6 months and have a meeting to talk about it, and to not have the final piece of what was their response to your investigation, and not to have something that is, more than what we have had. To me, seems that there is room for improvement. And I would ask that all of you please get in touch with me and Michael King and the Inspector General and see if we can work through some of the wording that perhaps you feel could be improved, so that we don't have any legal actions or incriminating actions that perhaps we're making or putting our employees or directors vulnerable to. All right, if there's no other conversation, why don't we table this to the next meeting? And if there's no other business?
Madam Chair?
Yes, go
If I
ahead.
may.
Yes.
I'd first of all just like to say thank you. Thank you, because I do think it's an important piece of legislation. But I want to say thank you to everybody here. I mean, this is democracy. This was a great conversation.
Yeah.
It was open, in public, raising good points. I wish more bodies in this country worked this way. So thank you.
Good. Yes, and I do thank you all for your comments. Yeah. Thank you all. If there's no other business, we will table this and we are adjourned. Thank you.